In this video, I'll be talking through how to answer an exam question on Inspector Goole from an Inspector Calls. If you are familiar with my other videos, you'll know that I tend to focus on the requirements of the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam. But if you're here just to learn more about the inspector and to be able to analyse his character in great detail, then you've come to the right place. So first of all, if you do get a question on the inspector, I would expect that you know all of these things just as a kind of foundation. He claims to be an inspector. We'll come back to the word claim in a moment. And he arrives at the Burling household with the purpose of investigating each character and trying to understand their involvement. At least, well, he doesn't really need to understand anything, but get them to talk about their involvement with Eva Smith. He exposes each character for their selfish and cruel treatment of Eva Smith. And through that, he aims to highlight the importance of social responsibility. What we notice with the inspector as soon as he enters the stage is that he takes control of the room. And from the moment he's there till the moment he leaves, he is the one in charge. He is a dramatic foil to Mr. Burling. They are direct opposites. And through that contrast, the Mr. Burling in particular, you could say is a dramatic foil to all the characters in moments, but Mr. Burling is kind of the protagonist. So let's focus on that. But really through that contrast, we get to see, or at least kind of emphasizes the selfishness, the heartlessness of Mr. Burling. And then also through that serves to highlight the wonderful characteristics of the inspector. Okay, he's compassionate, he has candor, and he's clearly kind of socially or morally superior to the others on stage. By the end of the play, we have questions of what he is. Basically, we don't quite know if he is an inspector, and again we'll look at that towards the end of this video. Overall, he's this embodiment of socialist values, and I've definitely read some critics call him Inspector Priestley because he is basically J.B. Priestley. He is used to voice all of the thoughts, all the values, all the ideas that J.B. Priestley has, and to relate not only to the characters on stage, but of course to promote these socialist ideas to the audience in 1945. I have this in every video. If you've listened to this part in my other videos, skip it a few minutes because it's basically the same thing. But if you are sitting the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature, it's important to know that the mark scheme does not require you to talk about context. There are no marks awarded for it. However, knowing some of the context can help you analyse. It can make you think about the intentions of J.B. Priestley, and it can make you think about the intended audience that he wrote for. So first of all, he is a socialist, and he wrote this play really to undermine capitalism, to expose the flaws in such a rigid social class structure, and through that to promote an alternative, which is socialism. Overall, it's a morality play. We certainly see that with the inspector. He is a moral character, but there are definitely elements of melodrama, and it's kind of a murder mystery, but it's a weird one, right? Because we don't end up pinpointing one person who's murdered anyone. In fact, it's the opposite. Our viewpoint is broadened, and we end up looking at all the characters on stage, and kind of divvying out the responsibility in that sense. So he's a different kind of inspector, and we'll again look at that at the end of the video. Keeping in mind the original audience, when you're talking about the intentions of Priestley and the effect of the audience, you have to really think about the audience he was writing for and their own experiences. So, this is an audience in 1945. Just a reminder that the play is set in 1912. So the characters on stage know nothing about what's going to happen to them, and there's going to be a really hard time ahead. I mean, a hard time is really an understatement. So here are a few things that the audience know that the characters on stage do not. The Titanic will sink. despite Mr. Burling repeatedly saying it's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. It will sink. And that really sends a message. It takes credibility away from these industrialists, these wealthy individuals who think they know best. So already it kind of sends a message to the masses that they are not necessarily to be trusted. They don't always know everything. This audience has gone through 2 world wars, and what they have seen in those world wars is that the working class typically pay the biggest price. Okay, those soldiers that lost their lives, they were more likely to be from a working class background. Are they going to return to Britain and accept the status quo as it were in 1912? Absolutely not. They want a much fairer society. Why did they sacrifice so much to protect a life that was not great for them, as we see through Eva Smith? Women have, or the suffragette movement specifically, has achieved lots of things by this time. One thing in particular is the vote for women. So what we see here is that women are getting a voice. And we see that through the Inspector Goole. You know, in 1912, he tries to give Eva Smith a voice, okay? Being of a working class background, being a woman, she's particularly vulnerable and certainly overlooked in 1912. And if you like, Inspector Goole is quite forward thinking in that way. He's quite modern for 1912, and he's certainly much more aligned with the mindset of a 1945 audience. They've also gone through the Great Slump, which is otherwise known as the Great Depression, so an economic hardships, and that could lead, as well as other things, lead to many worker strikes. People are not happy. The working class are not happy. They want a better deal. Okay, so again, if you are sitting the Edexcel English Literature IGCSE paper, you will be required to include these 3 elements in your analysis. You need to talk about language, form, and structure. So throughout this video, you will notice I have highlighted those things that are language in yellow, those things that are form in blue, and those things that are that relate to structure in green. And what you need to do is basically ensure you have a rich variety of all 3. You do not have to, I've seen this with other students, count, oh, well, I have 3 points about language, so I better do 3 points of the other 2. You don't have to do that, okay? It doesn't have to be equal, but you do need to have a good range. Okay, I would start with focusing on how authoritative the inspector is presented. One way is looking at how the stage directions describe the way he enters the stage. The first thing we hear is this sharp ring of the doorbell, and Burling stops to listen. Just a reminder, Burling is going on one of his many rants, talking at everyone basically about his capitalist ideals and putting down these socialist ideals, and cutting off his son, who wants to speak about the prospect of war and so on, and he's talking a load of gibberish basically. The audience know that because they know what's ahead. The sharp ring of that doorbell symbolises the way the inspector is going to forcefully interrupt the thoughts and actions of the Burlings and Gerald, not just in that moment during that speech, but in life. He's interrupting the way they think and the way that they behave. And so it really signifies the power he has to make Mr. Burling stop and listen. Before this, you may think that no one could have made Mr. Burling stop, but he can. So again, that we've already got this sense of his power and his influence over the room, and he hasn't even stepped on stage yet. So furthermore, that interruption relieves the audience as well of Mr. Burling's ramblings. And you might go as far as to say this mirrors the way Priestley believes socialism could offer that same relief from a capitalist society. Looking at the stage directions at the beginning of the play, he's described as creating at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. It also mentions in those stage directions that he doesn't have to be physically big, but he just gives off that impression. So it immediately establishes him as a powerful figure. So looking at that first phrase, an impression of massiveness, that implies that he's got this quite imposing nature, and that foreshadows how he is able to intimidate the other characters. He also has a sense of solidity, and that really emphasizes his strength of character. He has really strongly held convictions. He will not be swayed. His sense of purposefulness really mirrors the way he's going to arrive with a sense of determination in pursuing his goal. And that goal is to open the characters on the stage, open their eyes to their own flaws, and to inspire change in them. And of course, through that, Priestley is hoping he's also going to inspire change in the audience. There are lots and lots of stage directions I could have used. I've used a few here as examples. I wouldn't suggest that you use all of these in your answer, but just pick one or two that you could zoom into. But throughout this play, there are multiple stage directions that reflect the way he commands control of the room. If you look specifically at stage direction sternly and sharply, that I think is a really good reflection of how serious he is and how severe his manner is. And that again kind of supports this idea of how intimidating he is, but of course how he will not be manipulated by the other characters. And that is something in particular that Mr. Burling has been used to. We get this sense that he's been able to kind of bribe his way and kind of name drop his way through society. And that's not going to happen with the inspector. Look at how he controls his own investigation. He must wait his turn. One line of inquiry at a time. Stop and quiet for a moment and listen to me. So just think about that sense of authority and that tone. So specifically, I think you should be commenting here on those short declarative sentences. He uses short declarative sentences throughout the most of the play, and I'll mention in a moment when he doesn't and who he talks about when he does that. So here, that helps him maintain the control in the room because it creates this commanding quality and it helps steer the conversation. The modal verb must, he must wait his turn, stresses necessity, and it leaves no room for disagreement. The use of exclamation indicates the frustration he has at that point in the play, as well as the fact that he raises his voice at this point to regain control of the room. The imperatives quiet and listen are orders, and so therefore again he's telling the characters he must be obeyed. So again, he's not afraid of taking control in this moment, and he is not whatsoever intimidated by the fact that they are his social superior. And one thing you could mention about the audience is this could be quite a relief in some respects of watching someone of a lower class take control of a room with people who are supposedly his superiors. He's also wearing a plain darkish suit that's described in the opening stage directions, and that juxtaposes with the evening dress of the others on stage. The difference in clothing symbolizes the difference in social status, and like I just said, that does emphasize the unusualness of the inspector having authority in the room. But what this does do, and I think this is really important for Priestley's message, is through that he's highlighting that the inspector's power does not lie in superficial displays of respectability and wealth seen in the Burlings and Gerald. His power comes from the core of him, right? His core values. And so there's this greater message that Priestley is delivering here, and that is the power of socialism lies in much superior values. And really what he's saying is that there's a shallowness to capitalism that can be kind of easily undermined. He's very direct in the way that he navigates this investigation and the way that he communicates with the Burlings and with Gerald. So he is described in stage directions as speaking carefully and weightily. And so that tells us that he ensures every word he speaks holds value and meaning. And that contrasts him with Mr. Burling, whose speech is diluted with dashes and hesitations. And that really highlights that the inspector has confidence because he is full of conviction, and he's got, again, that sense of solidity, right? Because his values, as Priestley would argue, are on, a foundation, a much stronger foundation. Whereas Mr. Burling is exposed for having this false sense of certainty, this false sense of security in his speech. And what we learn is it's all very superficial. In those dashes and hesitations, we realise that he's not as confident as he presents himself. So the bigger message there is that the socialist ideas are built on a much stronger foundation, as I've said, and they can be confidently defended and upheld. Look at the way he speaks about Eva Smith and her condition. It's too late, she's dead. And then another quote, her position now is that she lies with a burnt out inside on a slab. Okay, whew, that's kind of shocking, and it should be shocking. So those short declarative sentences really successfully create a blunt tone, and what the reason for that is he wants to relay the harsh consequences of their actions. He doesn't want to soften anything for them and make things comfortable for them. The whole point of him being on stage is to make them feel uncomfortable and to realize the cruel reality of what they have created and what they have caused for Eva Smith and many people like her. He uses that vivid imagery to shock them and to shock the audience as well. The frankness in his dialogue really contrasts with characters like Eric and Gerald. If you haven't looked at my videos for them, please do. But we notice when they talk about their interactions and what they've done with Eva Smith, they're not very direct at all. They use euphemisms. They use the third person to distance themselves from what they're saying. And really what they're doing there is they're trying to undermine their actions. They're trying to avoid taking responsibility. So through this contrast, Priestley highlights the integrity of the inspector and therefore the integrity of socialism, because of course that is what he is presenting. Look at how he speaks to Mr. Burling. No, sir, I can't agree with you. And this is quite early on in the play. That modal verb can't stresses the complete impossibility of the inspector agreeing with Mr. Burling. And that really sets them on that political spectrum. They are on opposite sides. It is impossible for them to agree. Socialism on one side, capitalism on the other. So they have these kind of completely different sets of values. And it is clear from this very beginning that the inspector's stance cannot be wavered. Okay, going back to this idea of him having solidity, he will not change. He has great conviction. And this is reflected in his candor, and that means kind of his honesty. He's very open, he's not afraid to disagree. And then he says to Mrs. Burling, closer to the end, you're not telling me the truth. That direct address and declarative sentence create an accusatory tone. His straightforward speech aims to expose the dishonesty of Mrs. Burling and demands she tell the truth. And again, it's kind of really satisfying as an audience member to watch that. This is a woman who is very judgmental, who you might argue has delusions of grandeur. She thinks she's much better than people who have worked harder than her, who have shown greater characteristics than her, such as Eva Smith. It's kind of satisfying to sit there and watch the inspector put her in her place. So it makes him really likable as well amongst the audience. He is definitely a moral compass. Look at the beginning when he refuses alcohol. He says, no, thank you, I'm on duty. His refusal of alcohol is one of the first indicators that he is of a high moral standing, certainly in comparison to the others on stage. Alcohol is a symbol of wealth and indulgence, and therefore refusing it tells us that the inspector is different, right? He is their moral superior. It also indicates that the inspector cannot be bribed, and that makes Mr. Burling completely powerless. Like I've said previously, he's used to being able to bribe his way, name drop his way, intimidate his way through life and get away with things. That is not going to work with the inspector, and therefore he becomes this moral compass. He contradicts Mr. Burling when he says, if you don't come down hard on these people, they'll ask for the earth. It's better to ask for the earth than to take it. So his comparison draws contrast between the actions of the rich and the poor. He's comparing asking to taking, and that highlights the fundamental differences between these two classes. He's saying, to ask, which is what the working class were doing with asking for higher wages, is something that requires conversation, cooperation, and respect. All of those things seem really quite civilized. Well, to take something, which is what he is accusing the middle and upper class and these industrialists of doing, implies theft, dishonesty, and entitlement. So he makes it really clear. You're complaining about her asking for the earth. Well, you took it. Okay, who are you to criticize? So he's really kind of turning that point that Mr. Burling makes on its head and giving him a new perspective. And again, this comes back to him being that moral compass. Let's look at this in a different light. Then describing what Eva Smith went through, giving them background to help them understand what she was going through. She had no work, no money coming in, living in lodgings, no relatives to help her, few friends, lonely, half-starved. She was feeling desperate. So when he speaks of Eva Smith's lived experiences, we notice that he becomes much more detailed in his dialogue. We've seen before that he often speaks in declaratives and short, blunt sentences. But when speaking and relaying Eva Smith's experiences, he's much more detailed. So those asyndetic listing emphasizes the relentlessness of her hardships and the semantic field of suffering, with the lonely, half-starved, desperate, highlights her emotional, physical, mental turmoil. She's affected in all kinds of ways. And this is a really emotive presentation of Eva, which juxtaposes with Mr. Burling's dehumanizing label of her as just being cheap labour. And that reflects how capitalists, according to Priestley, are devoid of compassion. And more importantly, giving that detail is because he wants to give Eva Smith a voice. Even in her death, he thinks it's important that someone stands up for her and talks on her behalf. And then again, speaking on behalf of the working class, speaking on behalf of the poor, look at how much more detailed he is. Their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. So the use of contrast here highlights the many possibilities of one's life. And that suffering does not have to be an inevitability, right? He talks about their hopes. They can have hopes, they can have fears, they can have suffering, but they can have happiness, okay? So he's trying to give this sense of, this is a human life. It should have all the opportunities that you have for both hope and fear, for both suffering and for both happiness, okay? Suffering should not be an inevitability just because you are poor. The verb intertwined is so important here because it underscores the nature of our interconnected existence that he's trying to emphasize to the Burlings and to Gerald. He's trying to get them to recognize that they are part of a community. That tricolon, think and say and do, is him outlining how it's not enough just to think differently, actually, but we must also profess these values. We must say them out loud, and we must demonstrate them. We must do them. Okay, so you might argue, as an example, I would say that Eric, we know that he thinks differently now, and to some extent he says differently. I'm not sure he will do anything different, whereas Sheila, I'm much more confident she'll do all three. But he's saying that it's important that you change completely, not just in the way you think, not just in the way you talk, but the way you behave as well. And then finally, one of the last things he leaves with them, we don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. So the anaphora, that's the repetition of the we, okay? Draws attention to those first person plural pronouns, we, okay? And that reiterates the sense of shared responsibility and community. We also have the phrase member of one body, which is a biblical allusion, which refers to the Christian belief that all believers unite to form the body of Christ. And just to keep in mind that, the audience would most likely in 1945 be Christian. So this would really appeal to their religious beliefs. And by drawing parallels to their Christian faith, he's highlighting that socialism, according to him, is morally superior and much closer to their Christian faith. He's omniscient, and this is where a lot of people finish the play and go, what have I just witnessed? What is going on? Who is he? So I kind of put a little disclaimer at the top here with the asterisks. So there are some things to consider here. Right from the beginning, you may have already thought hold on, there's something not quite right about this inspector. He seems to know too much, okay? He claims to know a lot about Eva Smith from a letter and a sort of diary that she left. But she's only been, according to him, she's only been dead for a few hours. So he seems to know a hell of a lot of information within just a few hours. And his investigation seems to be so different in nature. Rather than narrowing down the investigation to one suspect, his focus broadens to the whole family and Gerald. And this foreshadows that the inspector is a different kind of inspector. So we may not get to the point of him realizing he's otherworldly, but from the beginning, we know he works differently. And so what we should realize is that he's not here to find out the truth because he already knows all the facts, which I'll talk about in a moment. He's here to inspect their souls. He's not here to arrest anyone and try them in court. He's inspecting their souls. It's deeper than that. And then let's have a look at some examples of how he seems to know everything. Sheila is the first one to clock onto it, okay? When Gerald thinks he can keep his involvement with Eva Smith quiet, she says he knows, of course he knows. So she observes that he seems to know all the facts. And so she's the first one to kind of portray him as all-knowing. Later on, he says something and she looks at him curiously, goes, I was just going to say something like that. Those stage directions, again, indicate that she's got suspicions as well around him. He seems to be able to read her mind, and she's quite intuitive. She has clocked on there's something different about him. He often speaks in declaratives, reflecting his certainty of the facts. And even when he asks questions, they do tend to be leading questions, okay? And then you decided to keep her as your mistress. So he's not actually asking that because he doesn't know the answer. He's telling Gerald, and now, come on, now you need to say the next bit. I know that she was your mistress, so say it, kind of thing. So it's not really designed to learn the truth, but it's designed to get the characters to admit to the truth. Let's look at the next bit. And I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Okay, so we've seen that he knows all the facts from the past, but actually what we're starting to see here is, does he know the future? His use of future tense gives his speech a prophetic tone. It's like he is telling what's going to happen in the future. The tricolon of fire and blood and anguish emphasizes the terror that the two world wars will bring in destruction, human sacrifice, and mental turmoil. So the audience, this is dramatic irony, because the audience already know that there's going to be two world wars, and what they realize that the characters do not realize, when he's saying you'll be taught in fire and blood and anguish, he's saying you're going to get two world wars and then you'll learn your lesson. Okay, so this is dramatic irony, and it's creating a frustration amongst the audience towards the characters on stage, because they're thinking, don't let it take two wars for us to do something about the flaws in our society. I wish I could go back to 1912, and I wish I could help change things now. They're encouraged to self-reflect as well, okay, because they're also thinking, well, hold on, I don't know what the future holds. How many more wars will it take for us to change today in 1945? So the inspector's accurate forecast also makes him the antithesis of Mr. Burling, and of course you could call him a dramatic foil to him, because of course Mr. Burling's future predictions of prosperity and peace and all the rest are wildly off, okay? So we definitely know he doesn't know what he's talking about. This encourages the audience to trust the inspector's advice and disregard the teachings of a capitalist ideology that's presented by Mr. Burling. And then finally, we had suspicions, but I feel like they are definitely confirmed at this point, right at the end of the play, when someone calls, because remember, Gerald calls up and finds, there's no girl. Oh my God, it was a hoax. We've been had. Isn't that hilarious? Thank goodness for that. Okay. And then suddenly they get a call at the end of the play and it says, that was the police. A girl has died. So this is the plot twist right at the end of the play, and that confirms our suspicions. The inspector is an otherworldly supernatural entity. He must be. Not only has he demonstrated full knowledge of the past and shown some indication that he can read their minds, he's been able to predict the future in specific detail. So now the fire and blood and anguish is quite vague. So you could say that's up for interpretation. But he made up a story about a girl dying, well, not a girl, Eva Smith dying by swallowing disinfectant. And then they find out it didn't really happen. Guess what's just happened by the end of the play? Eva Smith kills herself. So what he was actually doing there was telling them what was about to happen. So considering also his name is a homophone, right? Goole for ghoul, meaning ghost, the characters and the audience are left wondering who or what he is. Some might argue, and I really like this argument, that he is an allusion to the three ghosts from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. If you're not familiar, there are three ghosts in that novel. And the whole point of them is really to make the main character reflect on their past behaviour, consider their current attitudes and fear the future. And we certainly see that happen with the inspector. That's exactly what he's done. He's made them reflect on their past, and then they're already working on their current attitudes, fighting with each other, back and forth, disagreeing. And by the end, they have great fear, which we'll look at in a moment in the next slide. It could be argued, therefore, that Priestley echoes the message of Dickens in his novel, which was that positive change is in our grasp. That was the whole point of writing A Christmas Carol. And finally, with the other videos, I've always tried to organise the characters into whether they are static or dynamic characters. In other words, have they undergone any character development or not? The inspector's a different kind of person. He doesn't need to undergo any character development, because in Priestley's eyes, he is the perfect character. He has perfect morals and does not need to change. He doesn't need to learn anything. So instead, I would refer to him as a catalyst character. In other words, he is there to create change, to create a dilemma, to shake things up, basically. Okay, and we see this. These I think are two great examples of this. You see it in many ways, but I think these are the best examples to emphasize the way he influences the experience of the Burlings and Gerald. First of all, look at the lighting. The lighting goes from pink and intimate to bright and harder once he enters stage. So the lighting indicates a turning point for the Burlings and Gerald. Before the inspector entered their lives, when everything was pink and intimate, they saw life from a rose-tinted perspective. They enjoyed a great sense of comfort. Now, the inspector, with that brighter and harder light, is really metaphorically shining a light on their lives and character and exposing their flaws. Just like a harsh light exposes the flaws of, if you were to look in a mirror, right, with a harsh, bright light, it would expose, well, I'm sure you're all young, you won't need it. But for me, all my wrinkles, okay, and all my pimples, okay, he's doing that metaphorically with them. Look at the way they conduct themselves. At the beginning, they are celebrating and are pleased with themselves. By the very end, they stare guiltily and dumbfounded. So the contrast in stage directions from the beginning to the end of the play really demonstrates how the inspector has affected these characters. They've gone from celebrating and pleased to guiltily and dumbfounded. So what's happened? They've lost their sense of superiority, they've lost their sense of certainty, and they've lost their sense of joy. I think the most important word here to focus on is the adverb guiltily, because it does reveal, even though Mr. and Mrs. Burling especially, in their dialogue, seem to not have changed, they are looking guiltily by the end. And that does reveal that they have, to some extent, grasped a sense of responsibility. And of course, some more than others. Sheila and Eric certainly feel much more guilty than any of the others. And this would never have happened without the inspector's visit. So he has been able to change all of them, some more than others. Remember, he said that the youngest are the most influential. Okay, so remember, in your conclusion, make sure that you bring it to an overall message and you don't just repeat the main points and bore your examiner to death, okay? You want to bring it to a wider, greater message. What is the point of the inspector? Why did J.B. Priestley create them as a character? So I think you could explore these things First of all, I think he delivers this message that for real change, people need to change their attitudes, words, and actions. Remember, we talked about that kind of think and say and do. He's there to expose the flaws of the middle and upper classes. He acts as a dramatic foil to all the characters, really. We've already talked about that, mainly being with Mr. Burling. But he does that to expose their flaws. He's there to inspire the audience to use power for good. He is the most powerful character on stage, and he is the only person who has used his power for good. And the ultimate thing through all of that is really to promote socialism. As we've talked about, J.B. Priestley was very much a socialist and wanted those ideals to spread through society and make wider changes. Okay, I hope that helped. For those that are watching in 2025, I promise you Eva Smith will be out before your exam. Bear with me, okay? I'm going to try and release it on Sunday. I am in the US, so I'm potentially up to 9 hours behind some of you, so it may be Monday for you, but I will have it out before your exam. If you haven't subscribed, so you know, you'll get a notification when I upload that video. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Mrs. Rumsey at mrsrumsey.com. If you have any other ideas, there are so many ideas for the inspector. It took me ages to condense this because I had so many quotes to begin with. But please feel free to share them in the comment section.